Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, last week I released the Facebook files, emails between the CDC and Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, that show how government health bureaucrats were able to influence the COVID debate on social media throughout the pandemic. Messages I obtained as part of the state of Missouri's lawsuit against the federal government showed that the CDC and Facebook communicated constantly, sometimes daily, and that Meta asked federal health officials to vet specific claims about vaccines, about masks, and even about the origins of COVID-19. In May of 2021, CDC officials began routinely vetting claims about COVID-19 vaccines that had appeared on Facebook. The platform left it up to the federal government to determine which assertions were accurate, as you can see here. Facebook's moderators note that some of the above claims would already be violating an implicit admission that the CDC's opinion on the other claims would be a deciding factor in whether the platforms would restrict such content. Facebook was clearly a willing participant in this process. Moderators repeatedly thanked the CDC for its help in debunking. Claims vetted by the CDC included whether COVID-19 is man-made. The CDC told Facebook that it was theoretically possible, but extremely unlikely. Now, if the tone of Meta's communication seems extremely friendly, it's worth noting that staffers viewed government employees at the CDC as their colleagues. They used that word to describe them. In one email, Meta discussed providing said colleagues with access to a reporting channel for COVID misinformation. The list of individuals with access included CDC staff, as well as employees at Reingold, a communications firm advising government health agencies. Keep in mind that while the CDC was privately advising Facebook on which assertions it should allow on the platform, Democratic political figures, including President Joe Biden, railed against social media companies for not censoring enough alleged misinformation. Biden said Facebook was killing people. So here's the big question, it's the one raised by the lawsuit. Taken together, does the federal government's actions, its pressure campaign on social media companies, violate the First Amendment? Facebook, after all, is a private entity and thus is within its rights to moderate content really in any fashion it does see fit. But the federal government's actions can't simply be waved away. A private company may choose to exclude certain perspectives, but if the company only takes such action after politicians and bureaucrats threaten it, reasonable people might conclude that the choice was an illusion. Such an arrangement whereby private entities, at the behest of the government, become ideological enforcers is unacceptable, and it may be illegal. That's the subject of this radar, and also of my cover story for the March 2023 issue of Reason magazine. You should check that out. There is a word for government officials using the threat of punishment to extort desired behaviors from private actors. It's called jawboning. The term arose from the biblical story of Samson, who is said to have slain 1,000 enemies with the jawbone of a donkey. According to the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, the word's public policy use began with World War II-era Office of Price Administration and Civilian Supply, which primarily relied on verbal condemnation to punish violators. President John F. Kennedy jawboned steel manufacturers in the 1960s when he threatened to have the Department of Justice investigate them if they raised prices. Jimmy Carter did the same to try to fight inflation in the 1970s. During the 2000 presidential campaign, Republican candidate George W. Bush explicitly stated that he would jawbone Saudi Arabia to secure lower energy prices. John Kerry criticized him for it. While jawboning has generally referred to economic activity, to attempts to intimidate other entities into changing prices or policies, there's a history of speech-related jawboning, too. Will Duffield, a policy analyst at the libertarian Cato Institute, thinks the federal government's jawboning on COVID-19 misinformation might violate the First Amendment. Multiple arms of the administration delivered the jawboning effort together, he told me in an interview. Each one component wouldn't rise to something legally actionable, but when taken as a whole administration push, it might. In a recent paper on social media and jawboning, Duffield pointed to two very different Supreme Court precedents that could provide insight: Bantam Books versus Sullivan and Blum versus Uretsky. In the 1963 Bantam decision, the court held 8-1 that a Rhode Island commission had unconstitutionally violated the rights of a book distributor when it advised the distributor against publishing obscene content. In the court's view, the implicit threat of prosecution under obscenity law was an act of intimidation. Richard Posner, a widely cited former judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, referenced this decision, Bantam, in a 2015 case, Backpage v. Dart, where Tom Dart, an Illinois sheriff, had attempted to throttle the advertising of adult services on internet platforms by threatening credit card companies that do business with them. Ruling against Dart and in favor of the platforms, Posner wrote that a public official who tries to shut down an avenue of expression of ideas and opinions through actual or threatened imposition of government power or sanction is violating the First Amendment. So if that standard were the law of the land, it would be difficult to view the Biden administration's jawboning as constitutional. However, in the 1982 Blum case, the Supreme Court took a much more dismissive view of informal government pressures. That decision held that government jawboning is only illegal when the state has exercised coercive power or has provided significant encouragement, either overt or covert. Now, a better solution to all of this would be to explicitly prohibit government officials from engaging in jawboning. Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers, a Republican representative from Washington, has introduced a bill, the Protecting Speech from Government Interference Act, that would penalize federal employees who use their position to push for speech restrictions. Enforcement would be akin to the Hatch Act, which prohibits federal employees from using their positions to engage in campaign activities. If this bill were to become law, federal officials would have to be much more careful about advising social media platforms to censor speech or risk loss of pay or even termination. This is the superior approach. Legislators should regulate government employees' encouragement of censorship on social media platforms rather than the platforms themselves. So, Batya, I published last week these emails from the CDC to Facebook that I thought were astonishing. And look, people can reach whatever conclusions they want to reach. I was blown away by and thought people should know about how frequent the communications were between the CDC and Meta, how much guidance and input was sought by the social media companies from the government. At the same time that in public, Democratic political figures were threatening these companies with increased regulations if they didn't do more to fight misinformation. With all of that in mind, and with everything we've seen with the Twitter files in mind, the question becomes, does this skirt the line, cross into a violation of the First Amendment, even if even if the government didn't explicitly ban or arrest or pass a law violating the speech rights and thus violating the First Amendment? Is the pressure enough when you put all of these elements together to say that something unconstitutional was done? And it's an open question, but that was me kind of exploring it. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, your reporting has been incredible and a real addition to the conversation. It was, I think, really important to take it away from the Twitter context and show that it's, hashtag not just Twitter, right? And also to take it out of whatever sort of conditions, were set on the Twitter files. You did your own reporting, and it's really incredible and really important, Robby. I think you're completely right. The question is, to what degree is this jawboning something that, to what degree was there an implied coordination between, let's say, the CDC and lawmakers who could penalize social media companies? I totally agree with you. I think the question is still out. However, what you have uncovered is still very bad. And I think, even if you're a liberal and even if you thought that COVID misinformation should be censored, you should not want your fellow Americans to live like this, right? To live in a context where they feel that there is this collusion, is the only word for it, for your side, even if this is your side, because that makes people crazy. It makes people feel silenced and unheard and subjected to a cabal. And you should not want that. I will say, I think that there's one question that I'm very curious about, which is, I think to make the jawboning argument, you would have to show that irrespective of the administration, the social media companies were behaving in the same way, right? Because the argument I would make is, if they were comfortable ignoring Trump administration requests because they were not ideologically aligned with them, I think that a little bit weakens the jawboning argument, because it shows that this was more social media companies' desire to enforce their own views rather than their fear of government reprisals. But again, this is nitpicking. What you've uncovered is extremely important, and I'm so glad that it's out there. And I really hope that this will be a wake-up call for liberals to see, it's just not fair that because you happen to be on the side of the people with this much power, therefore your view gets to be the only one that's heard. I really hope that people on the left can hear that message.
Thank you very much, Batya. Yeah, I wonder if they could do it all over again, the social media companies, and by it, I mean, the last, 4 or 5 years, how if it would be the same thing, or would there be even more pushback? Because I think Twitter, and I'm not even talking about the Elon Musk regime, but I bet a lot of content moderator type people at Twitter regret even giving the FBI, for example, an inch. And they did push back at first, and then then they got totally rolled over by this agency. I wonder if there's any similar thoughts, maybe for not all of it, but for some of them, for instance, at Meta, like when they, in the email where they informed the CDC that Fauci is coming under serious mockery for changing his positions on masks. Was that appropriate? Do they still think that was appropriate now that he's seen as a more nakedly political actor? Would they have warned the Trump administration, White House, that Trump, some viral claim mocking Trump is really popular on the platform? It's a very interesting question. So you're right, the difference between the administrations might be key. So I'm looking forward to what you have on your radar, Batya, and that will be up next. Stay with us.